I've thought about throwing this video together for a while now. For years, I've been thinking about this issue. It's just so obvious to me, but so few people seem to discuss it. People want to blame all kinds of different things for the slow release of new games, the lack of AAA releases, and how little content is actually within new games. They want to point the finger at the developers, they want to point the finger at publishers, corporate. But yeah, individuals aren't to blame for the problems with new games, nor are any particular group of people responsible for the problems with new games. I guess you could blame the consumer for what I'm about to discuss, but it's not really the consumer's fault. It's just due to the limitations of technology. So what am I talking about? Well, the main reason that new games and content for new games takes so long to develop and release is because it's so expensive to produce. And that's because of the high level of graphical fidelity, the high level of graphical detail. It's got nothing to do with, diversity hires or whatever else you want to blame. That's the number one factor. It's the cost and the time associated with producing all the features that people expect in a new game. All the lighting effects, the high level of detail on everything in the game. And I've been thinking about this a lot over the past 2 years with one of my favorite shooters, Hell Let Loose, because it just keeps coming back in my mind. If people could tolerate the level of graphical fidelity of the very first Call of Duty game, then Hell Let Loose could have new maps. I mean, well, who knows how often, but I assume they could release a new map every 2 or 3 months anyway, as opposed to like maybe two a year, as is, the case right now. But people won't tolerate the level of texture detail, the level of graphical fidelity that existed 20 years ago. So developers have to pour in a bunch of time and money to produce these extremely lifelike games. And so practically nothing gets done. These games just take forever to actually produce. I think that's really the number one factor. And I mean, it's just true. You can look at the development costs for practically any game. Almost all of it's got to do with, textures, the graphics, all that stuff. Like, new games are not far more complicated than old games were. In fact, there are a lot of old games that are way more complicated than new games that are coming out. But the new games are so much more expensive to produce. They take far longer to produce. It's all got to do with the graphics. And it's because the technology to produce these games isn't so developed that people can just throw these games together on a low budget in a short time frame. Programming, software, and obviously the actual hardware necessary to run these games is still really expensive, and it's not automated enough to get all this work done cheaply and quickly. So yeah, people demanding these extremely lifelike games, this high level of graphical fidelity, that is the number one thing holding back the release of a large number of games within a short time frame. In the early 2000s, studios like Rockstar, they would release two, sometimes even three games in a single year. Now it takes a decade plus to produce a AAA game. It's 100% to do with the graphics, cost to produce the graphics, the time, and it's just not going to change either. So what we're going to see is the drop off of a number of studios. A lot of studios are going to go bankrupt because they're not going to have the money to continue producing these games that are going to flop anyway, because, well, a lot of these games are garbage, and that is the fault of the development team, that the games are garbage, because whether a game is, beautiful to look at or not, it could still be fun to play. But these development teams suck, and then there's the unbelievable high cost to actually produce them due to the technology and the time. So AAA games are going to continue to take up less and less of the market. These indie games will continue to take up more and more of the market until eventually the cost to produce these extremely high detail games goes down enough to where even smaller studios can afford to produce them. And then that'll be the death of the AAA scene altogether. There won't be any big AAA developers anymore. It'll all be thousands of different studios producing, these games that are on par with the games that are coming out right now from AAA studios for a fraction of the cost. But yeah, until we reach a point where these high quality games are extremely cheap to produce, we're just going to see low and mid texture detail, graphical fidelity games from indie studios, and then we're going to see these AAA games that flop, and then the studios will fold. So we're going to see a lot less money invested in gaming from major corporations until the cost to produce games lowers dramatically, and we will see low-cost games flourish in this market. And they'll flourish not only because they'll be far cheaper, not only for the consumer to purchase, but also for the teams to produce. But also because typically the smaller scale, cheaper to produce, lower quality in terms of graphics games, they're typically passion projects, so they're usually a lot better designed than the AAA games that are, well, they're just terrible now. Most AAA games are terrible. And that's totally aside from the graphics issue. But the whole graphics thing, the cost to produce these high quality games, that is the number one thing that's going to kill AAA gaming. Not just the fact that the games actually suck, because there are all kinds of terrible games that still sold well in the past, and they still made a profit for the corporation that produced them because they were way cheaper to produce. Just think of the Marvel movies. A lot of those sold extremely well, but they didn't do very well because the cost to produce them was so high. Whereas, let's say the cost for any one of these movies was half of what it was. Obviously, it would done far better for the corporation. And that's just because the cost of producing a movie to the modern standards that an audience expects now, is far higher than it was 60, 70 years ago. And that's what's going on with gaming. The standards that the consumers expect are so high, they're so expensive to meet, that AAA gaming isn't really profitable anymore. These AAA games, these AAA studios will continue to fail until the cost of production drops dramatically. And that's kind of what I fear for Hell Let Loose, is that it's going to die because, well, the graphics of the game are so expensive. These maps are so expensive and time consuming to manufacture that, they're just not going to be able to release new content in a short enough time frame to hold the audience they already have. And they're not going to draw in more players each month than they lose. They lost me about a year or so ago. I'm not sure, I'd have to check my channel, but they lost me quite a while ago because there's no new content. But like I said, that could be rectified almost overnight if the player base would accept the graphics of, let's say, the first or second Call of Duty game. If people could tolerate that level of graphical fidelity, then obviously the production team, the developers, could roll out new maps all the time. They could roll out new factions, new weapons, all that within a relatively short time frame. But that won't happen. And again, I'm not trying to blame the consumer. It's not really the consumer's fault that, that's just the way that things go. Technology improves, people adapt to new standards. If new standards aren't met, people don't want to deal with it. I get that. But the standards now are so high, like I said multiple times now. I'm repeating myself now, I know. But people either need to lower their standards or the technology needs to improve very rapidly. Otherwise, like I said, these AAA studios are going to go completely under, which I really don't care about either way. But almost all these multiplayer games and that's what they've been doing for over a decade now. They come out with a bunch of content all at once, and then there's a very, very slow trickle of content over the course of years until they can't produce new content anymore within a short enough time frame to, hold their current audience, and then they just fall apart completely. Like what happened with Postscriptum. But see, now Postscriptum's released a bunch of new content, so they've got a little bit of an audience again, but they're not going to actually be able to maintain that. So they'll drop off again too. In any event, yeah, modern gaming is just dead. I just wish people would lower their standards for graphics. That way we could actually get some new games from major studios, from experienced developers relatively cheaply. Within short time frames, we get a greater variety of games, but it won't happen, and the technology isn't there yet. The technology isn't sophisticated enough to facilitate the rapid development of new games, so it is what it is. In summary, the limiting factor determining how many games are released within any time frame is the cost and time associated with modern graphics, with the modern consumer expectations of what the graphics will be, what the level of graphical fidelity will be. Now, while a very poor development team will affect the quality of the game, they won't substantially impact the development time. The development time for a new game is necessarily long due to the consumer expectations for graphics, and that's something that even an experienced development team cannot completely circumvent. So yes, although a poor development team will lower the quality of a game, people responsible for designing various aspects of the game, yes, they may lengthen the development time, they may shorten it, They may create a terrible product, they may create a good product, but these things are tertiary compared to, as I said, the amount of time absolutely necessary to produce a game with the graphics that the consumers expect now. So, graphics are the limiting factor for new games, for development time. If people had lower standards, if people could accept older looking games, then we would have far more releases. That's really all I'm trying to say.